So up to this point, we've seen that the autonomic nervous system can regulate tissues other than skeletal muscle. And there's a pattern to this, and hopefully it's a familiar pattern that you've already learned in our previous units. We've talked about neurons that are firing action potentials. Those neurons release chemical messengers, and the chemical messengers bind to receptors on the postsynaptic cell. Here in the autonomic nervous system, we have our preganglionic neurons firing action potentials. That means they're releasing neurotransmitter into the ganglion, which again is the synapse between the pre and postganglionic neurons. And that's going to activate receptors on the postganglionic neurons that will give them a graded potential. That graded potential can then be used to start the action potential in the postganglionic neuron. Eventually, the action potential in the postganglionic neuron is going to cause that postganglionic neuron to release neurotransmitter. But one thing to point out again is that in that second synapse, we're going to be synapsing with a tissue that isn't a neuron or a skeletal muscle fiber. So in the autonomic nervous system, we have this chain of communication between three cells: a preganglionic neuron, a postganglionic neuron, and a target tissue. Now, there are a couple of things that might have jumped out earlier when I talked about the physiology of the sympathetic and parasympathetic responses. The first is that each division usually has opposite effects. So, for example, if we think about heart rate, we have a situation where the sympathetic nervous system has one effect, and the parasympathetic nervous system has the opposite effect. Your fight or flight response increases your heart rate. Your rest and digest response is going to decrease your heart rate. The second thing that's a little bit weird is that sometimes even using only one division, so say only the sympathetic nervous system, we can get opposite responses in the exact same tissue type. So for example, if we think about smooth muscle during the fight or flight response, what we see is that in certain places inside the body, it's going to relax to increase the blood flow. That happens around skeletal muscle and to increase the blood flow to my heart and to my lungs. But in other places inside the body, during the fight or flight response, I'm going to contract smooth muscle instead to shut down blood flow. That happens in the GI tract and in the kidneys. So during the fight or flight response, I can get both vasodilation to increase blood flow and vasoconstriction to decrease blood flow. And that can happen in different places at the exact same time. Now, in order to understand how that happens, we have to think about different types of neurons, different types of neurotransmitters, and different types of receptors that are used in each division. So neurons can be named based upon the neurotransmitter that they release. Neurons that release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine from their axon terminals are referred to as cholinergic neurons, cholinergic neurons. We've already talked about cholinergic neurons back in our skeletal muscle unit because the alpha motor neuron releases acetylcholine onto the motor end plate. That means that alpha motor neurons are cholinergic neurons. But cholinergic neurons are also found within the autonomic nervous system, and actually that's why we're talking about them again right now. In fact, all preganglionic neurons are cholinergic. So that means that all preganglionic sympathetic neurons are going to release acetylcholine into the ganglia. And it also means that all preganglionic parasympathetic neurons are going to release acetylcholine into the ganglia. So that means that we find acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter inside all of the ganglia. The chain ganglia, the collateral ganglia, and all of the parasympathetic ganglia as well. They all have acetylcholine. But importantly, the parasympathetic division is entirely cholinergic. So in the parasympathetic division, the postganglionic neurons also release acetylcholine, but that acetylcholine gets released onto the target tissues that they're regulating. The parasympathetic division is entirely cholinergic. The other type of neuron in the autonomic nervous system is called an adrenergic neuron. Adrenergic neurons are the neurons that release the neurotransmitter norepinephrine from their axon terminal. Now, adrenergic neurons are specific to the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. All postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic division are adrenergic, and that means that they all release norepinephrine onto the target tissues that respond to the sympathetic nervous system. So I know that this terminology is complicated, so let me just say this one more time. All preganglionic neurons are cholinergic in both divisions. The parasympathetic division is entirely cholinergic, so that means that the postganglionic neurons there are cholinergic too. Acetylcholine is the only neurotransmitter that that division uses. Only in the sympathetic division do we find adrenergic neurons. They're postganglionic, and that means that we're going to have norepinephrine released onto the target tissues from the sympathetic division.